Oh, I wish I took a picture. Maybe some personal photo here.
All right, hello everybody. Hi, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the launch of an event of acclaimed St. Louis area author Rafael Frumkin. I will be presenting his newest book, Bugsy Other Stories, a wildly imaginative story collection about queerness, neurodivergence, sexuality, and self-discovery, things we are all big fans of. So some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, funding your streets, parks, and more, and also helping to support authors and allowing us to produce events such as this. So thank you all for shopping local and supporting this event. For all of you joining us from afar, thank you so much for taking the time to be here digitally as well. You'll be able to participate in the audience Q&A at the end by leaving your question as a comment on YouTube there, so thank you. So we have a fantastic calendar of new events coming your way. Of note, next Thursday the 22nd, graphic novelist Nathan Powell will present his new book, Fall Through, an emotional and visceral tour de force following an underground punk band caught in a loop of an eternally repeating tour. And on Saturday, February 24th, we'll be welcoming acclaimed author of queer romance, Amy Spalding, with her charming, uplifting, and deeply relatable new romance at her service. A full calendar of all of our upcoming things, featuring names such as Philip B. Williams, David Finkel, Shannon Lee, and many more can be found on our website. There's sure to be something for everyone, so please check it out. For tonight's event, we are delighted to again be celebrating the launch of Rafael Frumkin's new book, Bugsy Other Stories. Rafael is a graduate from the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Medill School of Journalism. Their first novel, The Comedown, was published by Henry Holt in 2018, and their second novel, Confidence, was published by Simon Schuster in 2023. He lives with his partner, 2 cats, and 1 dog in Carbondale, Illinois, where they're an associate professor of creative writing at SIU. Frumkin's latest book is a deliciously entertaining collection of 5 genre-defined stories that range from downright hilarious to brilliantly unhinged. Taken together, they celebrate a wide variety of human experiences. With incredible insight, compassion, and honesty, Rafael unravels each story with tantalizing precision. Sexy and compulsively readable, this collection offers a look at our innermost selves as we all try to make sense of the world and our place in it. As Publishers Weekly says, Frumkin excels at getting into the distinct and sometimes dissociated mindset of his characters. It's an impressive depiction of life in the margins. Please join me in welcoming Rafael Frumkin.
Thank you, Evan, for that lovely introduction. And I noticed this is probably my fault. There's a typo in there. And I was looking at Dr. Netzley in the back row because I'm not an associate professor yet, though for the good works of folks like Ryan Netzley, who voted for my tenure case, hopefully I will be soon in the fall. Assistant still, but yes, I think I jumped the gun when I sent that.
I may have been speaking it into fruition.
Yeah, and let's do that, right? Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. So yes, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all so much for being here. It's a lovely group. It's an intimate group. I love Left Bank so much. This store and all y'all you do for St. Louis area authors and just like literature, literacy, and book selling in general. It's just a lovely place to be. So I'm kind of launching this book multiple times because I had an event in Carbondale, I had an event here, and I'm going to reprise here what I read in Carbondale last night. Selections from 2 of the stories in this collection. And I'll describe each and kind of contextualize the excerpts I'm going to read from. But before I do that, I want you all to know that this is a very special occasion for me because this book is like far and away the most personal book I've published. This is a very personal book, not because it's autofiction, right? Not because it's ripped from the headlines of my own life, but because a lot of the characters in this book share a similar set of preoccupations with me, right? Whether those preoccupations be about queerness and transness, or as the publisher's weekly blurb says, like life on the margins, or death and dying, right? Like aspects of the human condition that are germane to all of us. But I think as I was writing this book, it's a COVID book, so as I was writing this book during COVID, those are really salient for me. I was figuring out aspects of my own queerness. Of course, it was COVID, right? So we were thinking about illness, death, life, and all that kind of, went into this collection. So it's such an honor, such a privilege to be here with you all, sharing it with you. Let me grab my water before I launch into the excessive talking. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this first story, I'm sorry, I'm paying attention here. I'm just like the ADHD brain. I'm like, wow, that's weird. So this first story is the Gen Zers in the audience may know what this is about. You've heard of an e-girl, right? Bridget's laughing. You've heard of an e-girl, the concept of an e-girl, right? It's basically someone who makes content, which is another like really Gen Z phrase. Thank you guys. Just like makes creative content online, right? Like films on YouTube or posts on social media. That thematize basically like being a girl playing video games, and there's often a sort of like I don't know. There can be like a sexual nature to the content, right? Like there are Patreons, OnlyFans, and Snapchats that kind of go along with being an e-girl. But there's one e-girl in particular whom I really admire, and her name is Belle Delphine. I think Belle Delphine is a performance artist worthy of display. You too? Yeah. In seriously, I'll just say it. I won't implicate you, Bridget, but I think her work is worthy of display in the Met, in MoMA, just as much as someone like Marina Abramovich, who I just wrote an essay comparing the two. But Belle Delphine, like, yeah, sure, okay. The elevator pitch, she's an e-girl. She makes like surreal erotic content. You're like, wow, what? Right, sells bathwater, exactly. So you're kind of like, what's going on here? But if you dive into her oeuvre, right, you'll find that she's actually someone who's exploring what I think is the fundamental hyper-realism of being a woman, right? The fact that like the way you're supposed to look and act and be is impossible. It's unattainable. No one can ever get there. I certainly couldn't, obviously, right? But like cis women either. It's impossible to attain the ideal. And that's what Belle Delphine's always making fun of. So I wrote this story about this kind of performance artist e-girl based off of Belle Delphine named Dina Valentine. But now here's another Gen Z term, it's slashfic. So it's a form of fanfic that imagines a queer romance. These two get all of it. It imagines a queer romance where there is none, maybe in the canonical work or in real life or whatever. So that's my kind of preamble to the section I'm about to read, which is it is a sort of much ado about nothing style section in the story where Dina Valentine, Belle Delphine / Dina Valentine, that's the e-girl character, she realizes that she's in love with her best friend Aubrey. And as she realizes that she's in love with her best friend Aubrey, her reply guy stalker shows up to her house and asks her to marry him. And they're like, whoa, okay, let's put a pin in that, and we're just gonna go upstairs and figure this out. So at this point in the story, Garrett Stillwater, the stalker, has taken some MDMA with them, and he's just alone in the room while they've gone upstairs to smooch or whatever, or talk, or who knows what they're doing. And he has been charged with protecting the castle, right? Because Aubrey's boyfriend is angry and he might be coming. And again, if you like Ryan Netzley, have read a lot of Shakespeare and have written about a lot of Shakespeare, you will recognize this as a comedy with a ton of whispered asides and a rotating cast of characters that sort of come in and out of the room at all times. So that's where we are. And I'm just going to read to you from Garrett Stillwater's point of view. Look at me, I talk so much, you need more water already. Come on.
Listen to a love square. Listen to a love square.
The most hellacious love square.
Oh.
The worst polycule.
Does not function as a polycule. Okay, all right. He had done it. The thing he had most wanted to do in his life up until that point. How did he feel having accomplished a major goal? How did LeBron feel when he won an NBA championship? How did Chris Pratt feel when he got hot and landed the lead role in Jurassic World? Garrett rubbed the cushions of the couch and they felt soft and alive, like he was petting a massive dog. And he was having a very difficult time not thinking about Dina Valentine sitting on his lap, taking her shirt off and kissing him. He felt bad for Aubrey, dating a guy like Dennis. Of course she and Dina would need to regroup, strategize, have some kind of girl talk. Aubrey deserved that much. He, a feminist, would do Dina's bidding, acting as their protector, firmly escorting Dennis off the premises. He would get Aubrey back to her dorm without a hair out of place. This kind of guardianship would make Dina want him even more, would make their eventual consummation at 8 a.m, giddy and exhausted, feeling that coded to an action movie good guys won feeling, all the better. He felt good. He had never felt this good in his life. The thought briefly entered his mind that this was as good as he would ever feel, that he would need to make this moment last for as long as possible, because eventually his body would stop feeling glowing warm, and the couch would stop being made of dog's fur, and he would have to deal with the tedium and complications of reality. He had two options: stay like this, rubbing the couch, dreaming of how Dina would look when they finally got some alone time together, when she could finally try on her earrings and exclaim to him how beautiful they looked, how they fit her face perfectly. Or he could start thinking about how exactly he would get from this moment here on the couch to the greatest moment of his life, in which he would have sex with Dina Valentine for the first time. He chose the latter, but he would let himself look at his phone first. He had a text from Dave and some DMs from Bernie Flames You. First, the text. Dave, lol, so how did Project Lolita go? Garrett, dude, you would not believe what's been happening. Dave, you've been sitting in a Dunkin' Donuts crying for the past 6 hours? Garrett, LMAO. Garrett, I'm in her house right now, actually, on Molly. I showed her the earrings. Dave, what? Dave, you're actually in Dina Valentine's house? Garrett, did you think I was lying? Garrett took a snapshot of the wall in front of him, which included Bernie Flames You's Dina and Arthur painting, framed photos of Dina with other YouTube celebrities, a black and white portrait of Dina cosplaying as Wario, complete with angry mustache. He sent it to Dave, and then to Bernie Flames You, without reading Bernie Flames You's DMs. He couldn't bother talking to them anymore. They were too far behind him, existing in a world where Dina only appeared on monitors, a world where one went to work at 8:30 a.m. and came home at 5:30 p.m. and drank White Claw and played Metroid Prime. He couldn't bother with that world anymore. So, Dennis. Who was Dennis? Aubrey had said he went to Indiana University. Blinking hard to concentrate, feeling pleasantly lightheaded, Garrett opened his Facebook app and searched Dennis, Indiana University. He got 27 results, all pencil-necked white guys, with no way of narrowing them down. So then he opened Chrome and searched Aubrey Dennis, which got him results for Dennis Aubrey, 58, Minnetonka High School girls basketball coach. He scrolled through photos of Dennis Aubrey, mustachioed, slightly wall-eyed, and laughed a pity laugh, an embarrassment laugh, for all the guys in the world right now who weren't completely fulfilled. The doorbell rang. He stood up. He felt like his body was giving off rays of light. He felt infinite warmth toward the living room, love for the living room even. It was in this living room, after all, that he had first told Dina Valentine he loved her. The doorbell rang again, and he maneuvered through space to answer it. There was a thin guy with a nose ring and an undercut who wore a heavy-looking flannel. The guy said, "Hey, man," and walked past him, penetrating the fortress. Garrett had failed. But this was nothing he couldn't bounce back from. He closed the door and turned around. Dude, he said, as firmly as he could. What's up? Dude, you're like not supposed to be here. I mean, I got the call from my guy. He produced from his pocket a bag of mossy-looking stuff that Garrett understood immediately was weed, having smoked it a few times in college. This was maybe not Dennis. Oh, Garrett said. Oh, right. The guy laughed as well. So you ordered, or... yeah. Well, my girlfriend did, but she's upstairs. Oh, okay, cool. The guy walked toward the stairs. So up to the right, left? Oh, no, actually. Garrett walked swiftly to stand in front of him. She's talking with her friend. Her friend's in the middle of a crisis. Damn, okay. But I think I'll be done soon. Can you text her? Could Garrett text her? He technically could. He opened Instagram on his phone and typed in his DMs below the green heart, "Guy with weed is here." Just in, he said, pocketing his phone, smiling, a little domestic text between lovers. The guy sat down on the sofa and pulled out his phone. I actually have nowhere else to be. This isn't my job. I'm just doing my homie a favor. I can chill here until they're done. This was a weird idea, but not one Garrett was necessarily opposed to. He sat down on the couch next to the guy. The couch still felt like dog fur. The guy offered his hand to shake. Marco, he said. Garrett, this your place? Your girlfriend's? Well, hers originally, but we're in the process of moving in together, and we're going to get a second house that's a farmhouse. Dude, Marco said, turning briefly back to a game on his phone involving geometric shapes blasting other geometric shapes. That's awesome. Congrats. This place is tight as hell. These weren't lies necessarily. They were future truths. Garrett was so confident in them, so sure of his beloved's eventual agreement to these plans, that he was unafraid to speak them, especially to someone as inconsequential as Marco. Marco put his phone down and pulled out a pipe whose bowl was shaped like Homer Simpson's head, and began to pack it with weed from the bag he'd shown Garrett. You don't mind if I smoke a little, do you? He asked. Not at all, Garrett said, and watched Marco hit the pipe. When Marco offered it to him, he hit it too, and came up coughing. Marco laughed. You've been vaping more recently, or? Garrett nodded, gasping. Yeah, we've been vaping a lot. Me too, smoother. Where you work? Tech? No shit, me too, front-end development. Garrett nodded, making a mental note that Marco's job, while similar to his, was likely to be more boring. Marco turned on the TV, House Hunters, which he quickly exited out of, and then his eyes found Bernie Flame's used painting. What the fuck? What? Your girlfriend's Dina fucking Valentine? Garrett's chest warmed. This would be the reaction. This would be what he'd be dealing with for the rest of his life. Yup. Marco looked at Garrett, assessing him, and then back at the painting. Holy shit, man, she's like the hottest girl on the internet. Wait, like, how old are you? Isn't she 17? 18, Garrett said quickly. And I'm 25. Eventually, he'd start telling the truth, get better at explaining their 11-year age difference. Oh, nice, Marco said, and offered his hand for a high five, which Garrett half-heartedly reciprocated. Young blood. Disgusting. Now Garrett hated Marco. He got out his wallet, seeing what kind of cash he had that could make Marco leave. Just ones. Marco was watching The Irishman now. Garrett pretended to check his phone, making a concerned face as he did so. Shit, he said. What? It looks like they're not going to be down for a while. Shit, Marco said dreamily, taking another hit as the camera cut from Robert De Niro's grimacing face to the Philadelphia skyline. So, I don't have any cash. Do you have Venmo? Sorry, man. Cash only. Fuck. A full-blown obstacle. He took another hit when Marco offered it and stewed. No, he couldn't stew. He would need to turn this into a brainstorm. He would need to try to be productive. A knock at the door, then the doorbell, then another knock, then the doorbell a few times in quick succession. Yo, someone's pissed, Marco said. That her side piece? Garrett stood up without acknowledging Marco's very poor attempt at a joke and went to the door, looking out the peephole. It was Dennis for sure, skinny, with unkempt mushroom hair, a neck beard of acne, a leather jacket. He was much taller than Garrett had imagined him. His lips were set in the way school shooters' lips are always set in their photos on the news. Humorless, determined. Garrett opened the door a crack and positioned his foot behind it. Dennis pressed in immediately. Are you Dennis? Garrett asked. Who the fuck are you? Dennis said. Dennis, Aubrey, and Dina want you to leave. Dennis's features somehow constricted. Who the fuck are you? This one was riskier, but he would try it anyway. I'm Dina Valentine's boyfriend. Dennis looked Garrett up and down and laughed. Yeah, of course you are. And then he pushed in with surprising strength. Dennis was walking fast and Garrett was trailing him, as if by keeping within a 6-foot range of him at all times, he could somehow slow him down. Marco set down his pipe and stood up. Do you have a problem here? He asked. I need to talk to Eileen, Dennis said, and then rolled his eyes. I mean, Dina. Why? Marco asked. Tell us why, Garrett added, feeling useless. What do you two fucks need to know? Because you have a vibe, man, Marco said. It's not a good one. Garrett edged closer to Marco. All the warmth and wonderment he'd felt before had evacuated his body, and now he felt coldness and dread, and the kind of I don't want to go to school sick he remembered feeling as a kid the morning after Tommy Birkins poked the eraser end of a pencil hard into his side in the 4th grade. Dennis was more than a head taller than both of them. Where's the porn star? Dennis pressed. She's not a porn star, and what does it matter anyway? Marco said, slowly closing the space between himself and Dennis. Dude, Garrett said, unable to tell if he was speaking to Dennis or to Marco. Maybe let's... He had no idea how to finish the sentence. Dina Valentine is disrespecting my girlfriend, Dennis said, clearly trying to project his voice for the benefit of Dina and Aubrey. I need to talk to her. Maybe you need to talk to me, Marco said. Who the fuck are you? What does it matter? I'm not some skinny-ass white guy. Dennis charged at Marco, grabbing him by the collar, but Marco pushed him away. Affronted, Dennis charged again, and this time Marco swung. Garrett stumbled into a seated position on the stairs and watched as Dennis pulled back and his fist connected with Marco's face somewhere in the middle. And then Marco, whose nose was now bleeding, shoved Dennis off him and into the coffee table and then stood up and looked at Garrett as if Garrett had somehow created Dennis, had somehow set this whole horrible situation in motion. Yo, you're crazy, Marco said, wide-eyed, shaking his head. Y'all are fucking crazy. And then he ran out and slammed the door behind him, leaving the weed and pipe on the couch. Now Dennis was standing up and walking toward the stairs, and Garrett was thinking about his role as designated by Dina, and about what had happened to Marco, and about how much Marco weighed versus how much Dennis weighed versus how much he weighed. He was all that stood between Dina, and of course Aubrey, and Dennis, tall and angry Dennis. He had failed so far, but now, with Dennis standing square-shouldered before him, he had his chance to step into the role of protector, to show Dina conclusively what he knew she already knew, that he was the man who would live with her in the rambling farmhouse, who would raise 2 children with her, who would grow old with her, who would leave his wealth to her. He stood up and squared his own shoulders and affected a sneer to match Dennis's. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Dennis grabbed him by the shoulders and slammed him hard against the wall. And that's that excerpt. Okay, so I am going to read now from a story called The Last Show. And so when I talk about these stories being personal, this one really is kind of dives deep into my maternal grandmother's consciousness, imagined consciousness as she's passing away. And so our grandma passed from COVID, but she was pretty advanced in age. She was early 90s and super beloved by God. We all love her so much. And this story, the main character Flora, is modeled off her, right? And certainly the family is a bit modeled off of our own, but you know, and the only person who's going to know how close the resemblance is Emily. But really, I mean, whether you know how closely I hew to my personal life or not, the thing to keep in mind is that everything is ultimately an exaggeration. Everything is ultimately, right, like a blend of fact and fiction. And so you'll see that as I'm reading this story, the kind of biggest illustration of that is the fact that, like, I'm imagining her interiority in like three kind of registers, let's say. So she's actively dying, right? And she's diving into her past, right? She's thinking of her past, she's experiencing the present. And then there's this sort of like mystical kind of third category that is modeled off of if I'm sure folks here have seen On the Town, Gene Kelly, Frank Sinatra, the old classic Hollywood movie where they're sailors in New York. If you remember, that movie features a radio broadcast that's also being filmed in like a big dance hall in New York City. So it was like kind of like transition from like everyone is listening to the radio to everyone is acquiring personal TVs. And therefore, like, the radio television gap is kind of, people are trying to bridge it by like doing both at once. So this radio broadcast I actually brought into this story. So the Flora Doris character is kind of like bouncing among past, present, and mystical netherworld of this surrealist radio broadcast. I don't know, if you've read the Circe chapter of Ulysses, that was the vibe I was going for. Hold on one second, sorry. I will, I'll of course like signal when Flora is like transitioning among like spatiotemporal registers. I don't know how else to describe them. Okay. So of course we start in the past here. Of her sisters, it was a painful open secret that Flora was the prettiest. Suzanne, the younger, had been born with a cleft lip, and Beatrice, the older, had inherited their father's height in her ungainly proportions. But it wasn't just that Flora was pretty in comparison with her sisters. It was that she was pretty in comparison with anyone. When her family left Indianapolis for the lake house in Saugatuck every summer, the girls envied and gossiped about her, and the boys asked to dance with her every Saturday after dinner at the lodge. She was junior Miss Lake Michigan for 4 summers in a row, and then Miss Lake Michigan for 5 summers in a row after that. She was smart enough to know just what about her beauty was so infuriating to the other girls. It wasn't the neat measurements of her figure, or the fact that her hair had such a volume that she never needed to set it in curlers. It was that her face perfectly expressed her kindness. Whether she wanted to be wide-eyed and smiley and girlish like Judy Garland, or chin-tucked and reserved and sultry like Lauren McCall, she always looked kind. There were so many girls she knew who were very kind, but whose faces were too plain to express it. If she were among their ranks, she would have hated herself too. In Saugatuck, her mother busied herself with things she typically complained about when she had to do them in Indianapolis. Buying new curtains for the kitchen, cooking big dinners, cleaning the bathrooms, and emptying the lint from the dryer. If we could stay here all year, I'd be a happy woman, she told Flora. And then, when Flora was visiting hers, she lay dying of pneumonia and sepsis in a hospital in Orland Green. That house was like being in love. Flora's father, by contrast, read his paper in the living room and played Go Fish with Flora's older sister and listened to radio programs about the histories of Rome and Greece. The summer days sorted themselves out like this. Flora's younger sister tagging along with their mother as she tidied the house and baked cakes and cookies. Flora's older sister pretending to read the paper or a book across from their father in hopes that he'd stop reading and notice her. And Flora, caught somewhere in between. The family came together 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it was rare that they could be found together, or in some arrangement other than youngest and mother and eldest and father, at any other time of the day. Flora could remember one occasion at the lake house when she'd seen her father without her older sister nearby. She had been 12, walking upstairs to get something from the room she shared with her younger sister, when she noticed the door to her parents' bedroom was open. She was still young enough to be enthralled by her parents' lives, to assume that whatever happened behind their closed door was more interesting and important than anything that could ever happen behind her own. She crouched close to the floor and leaned her head in to see her father sitting on the bed, legs close together like a woman's, crying like a woman. Flora's scalp prickled with disgust, but she didn't look away. He held a pocket knife, and with the blade dug under the fingernail of his index finger. He was bleeding. His other fingers were bleeding. Flora gasped and dry heaved, and her father looked up, his tear-stained face alert, and told her to go to her room, or she wouldn't get any dinner. She obeyed. The summer she turned 16, a blonde boy named Dickie Fells asked her to dance at the lodge. He was new, but he was popular. He would flit from table to table during dinner, making the girls laugh and charming their parents. He played football in school and had plans to attend the University of Michigan in the fall, and eventually become a pharmacist like his father. He was going places, all the parents agreed. He had a large, square head and neat little rows of teeth. There were boys handsomer than him, the girls decided, but none as smart and funny. When she agreed to dance with Dickie Fells, Flora did not realize that he would put his mouth close to her ear and say, "I've had my eye on you all summer, Miss Flora Harvey, and I'm not going to stop chasing you until we're married." He said it in the same friendly timbre he used to joke with the parents, but something about it still frightened her. It was queer that she should be so frightened by someone as nice and funny as Dickie Fells. The summer she turned 17, she and Dickie were engaged, and she was planning to follow him to the University of Michigan in the fall. When she and her family arrived at the house in Saugatuck, 4 months before Flora's father died in the wreck, Dickie was waiting for her outside with a bouquet of roses. My, Dickie, these are beautiful," Flora's mother said, grabbing the roses from him and rushing them inside to a vase. Flora's father herded her sisters in after their mother, though not so fast that Flora's older sister couldn't pause on the topmost stair to stick out her tongue at Flora. Dickie took Flora's hands in his own. "I can't believe I'm really going to marry Miss Lake Michigan," he said, and she laughed, ignoring how his voice had grown slightly thin with impatience and anger. He'd tried to enlist the month before, but had been denied because of his flat feet, and he had been in a sour mood ever since. "I can't believe I'm really going to marry Dickie Fells, pharmacist to the stars," she said, which managed to flip some kind of switch in him, because he grinned, eyes brighter, and began running, pulling her along with him. "Come on," he said, "I want to take you somewhere." They ran up the hill behind Flora's family's house, beyond the houses on the lake, and then beyond the cabins rented by the families who couldn't afford the houses. They ran through a heavy copse of trees and emerged what felt like miles away, at a section of the beach Flora had never seen before. Flora could feel Dickie watching her as she admired the place, the stoneless sand, the reedless water, the scrum of bright white seashells between the tide and her feet. And when she looked back at him, his chest was puffed out like an explorer's. "Can you believe it? This place doesn't belong to anybody, just here for the taking." Over Dickie's shoulder in the distance was a collection of small houses, far more modest than the ones they'd run away from, but she said nothing about them. He pulled her into a kiss, and then they were down in the sand. The way he'd tell it to their friends years later was that Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr had copied him and Flora. And her shirt was off, and then his pants. When she saw From Here to Eternity after Arthur was born, she would find Dickie's comparison embarrassing, even if it was supposed to be a joke. What did a couple of teenagers struggling around in dirty sand on someone else's lakefront in Michigan have in common with 2 movie stars on a beach in Hawaii? Dickie's mouth was at her ear again, and he was saying, "My God, Flora, you're so beautiful." And she was looking at the sky above them, murmuring, "I love you," and then swiveling her head to take in the expanse of the beach, and this time she froze. Peter and his wife, dressed in bathing suits, had crested the hill between the houses and the lake and were now staring at Flora and Dickie, mouths agape. Peter's wife holding their toddler's head against her shoulder for fear he'd turn around and see what they were seeing. Flora sat up and Dickie fell from on top of her. "Please, I'm sorry," she shouted. She didn't know what else to say. And now she's like segueing into the present. Ava opened the curtains and looked out at the parking lot. Ariel called Arlo joined her, and they both seemed to be waiting for something awful to happen. "Mom," Ava said, "did you let the light in here?" There was something cold in Flora's stomach, something mechanical. She tried to make the word no, but only succeeded in closing her mouth a little and opening it again. "That's a yes," said Ariel called Arlo, and pushed the curtains open further. "How do you like that now, Grandma?" Flora remembered when Ariel called Arlo had tried to eat a hot dog Dickie had grilled and gone inside to throw it up and declared she was a vegetarian later that evening. She remembered the way Ariel called Arlo's eyes had danced at pastas, cheeses, and pints of ice cream. She closed her own eyes and saw flashes like neon signs and lit up billboards. There was a pressure at the base of her neck. There was the feeling that something in her body was trying to leave her body, and she didn't know what. She opened her eyes again, and Ava was sitting at her feet, holding one of her ankles. "Mom, did they tell you what happened last night?" Ariel called Arlo across the room, looking at her, or their, phone. "They said you may have had another stroke, a very minor one, in the pons. Very, very minor. Did the doctor tell you?" The pressure at the base of her neck still, the churning in her stomach, a machine's, not her own. "So that's the bad news, but the good news is that you're recovering so well from the other one, the big one." Ava cracked her knuckles, nasty habit, and began massaging Flora's feet, still so well behaved. She had become thin in her middle age, though the contours of her round child's face were still visible beneath the sharp edges of her chin and nose. Flora thought how watching your children grow old is like watching your own ghost stalk the earth. She closed her eyes. The room smelled of Ava's peach perfume and the minty spray Ariel called Arlo put in that inch-long hair to spike it. This was why Flora had always wanted girls. She knew they would be admirable in their beauty and loyal and kind-faced like she was. Even at their angriest, girls never did anything destructive, at least not the girls she'd grown up with, and certainly not her own. Boys were volatile, never long for the world, but girls wanted to be alive and were grateful for it. "So, Mom, can you hear me?" Ava raised her voice, and Ariel called Arlo's feet paced the room again. "They want to keep you a little longer for observation, okay? We're not out of the woods yet. And unfortunately, the feeding tube has to stay in for now because of the swallowing, but I'm not sure if that's a permanent thing. I'll ask Dr. Intentola about that. Mom?" Flora felt Ava's hand gently shaking her ankle, but something was keeping her from opening her eyes. "Arlo and I have to go back home for dinner, but I'll try to be back tomorrow morning if I can get off work. Dr. Intentola is going to come in to see you in the next hour or two. I wrote down a list of questions I had. He'll tell you the answers so you know them, okay? And Alan's coming tomorrow with Tommy and Ellen. We're going to get you out of here so soon. Keep your chin up, okay?" And now we're in the third place. It was dark. Flora was backstage. The commotion of the club behind her. She had never been backstage anywhere before. She was also a little drunk. There were stagehands or waiters, she couldn't tell, swarming in front and around and behind her, constantly and facelessly asking that she please step aside. "Peter?" she said, and said it again louder. The least populated corner of the place was also lit by a dim, naked light bulb. She made her way there, calling Peter's name as she did, and stopped in front of a door that read dressing room. She pushed it open. Inside was the kitchen where she prepared meals every day in Orland Green. Empty except for Arthur, in dungarees and a striped shirt, and that pair of church shoes she'd made him wear around the house to break them in. He was 10 or 12, still shorter than most of the boys in his class, and she could tell, now looking at him, that he was intelligent, not just in the way she'd always known him to be, in school and in Boy Scouts and in jerry-rigging pulleys and catapults and play forts, but in a strange way she hadn't noticed before, the same weight of the world way that made famous and important people sad, made them do things to jeopardize their fame and importance. She moved to approach him, but found she couldn't. She called his name, but he didn't hear her. He was on his tiptoes, opening the cabinet above the sink where she kept the liquor she cooked with. She tried calling his name again. He came away with a near-empty bottle of vodka and automatically drank the 2 or 3 fingerfuls left. Then he reached in again, a cheap bottle of rye whiskey. She shouted this time and tried to lift her feet, and then slid out of her pumps, but her pumps weren't the problem. Where the hell were the rest of them? What time was it? When had Arthur ever been left home alone like this? The sun out the window was still high in the sky. He took a swig of the whiskey and then sat down, smiling perversely. Flora sat down too. He stuck his pinky down the mouth of the bottle, tipped it so his finger would get wet with the liquor, and then sucked on it. This was a favorite habit of Dickie's. He often called himself the royal taste tester when he did this with wine. And Flora hoped Arthur would be done after this, would stand up and get himself a glass of water. Instead, he took another swig and then set the bottle down very carefully. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. There was nothing behind them. Flora called Peter's name, Dickie's, Ava's. Arthur fell to his side and began retching. Flora was on all fours then, shouting at him, trying to throw her pumps and bracelets and cigarette case to get his attention. Her son's face was smeared with sick. He coughed up chunks of a lunch she probably just fed him. This wasn't how he died. Or maybe she was in some awful place where this was how he died, and she couldn't do anything about it. She could leave then, but she couldn't move. And there, finally, were Dickie's feet. Flora sat up and Arthur's eyes blinked open, and Dickie said, "What the hell is this?" He was unshaven and tired looking. He had probably had one of his fitful sleeps the night before, and had gotten someone to cover for him so he could come home early. "Sit up," Dickie said, and kneeled next to Arthur. "Where's your mother?" Arthur, eyes still vacant, sweating out the liquor, shook his head. "I asked you a question and expect you to answer it." Arthur began to cry. "She's asleep," he whined. Flora winced. "Asleep? She'd slept through this?" "She said I could stay home from school because I was feeling sick," Arthur said. Dickie sighed. "I'm sure you were lying then, but you're clearly not lying now. You look a disgrace. Stand up." Arthur pushed himself off the floor and gripped the counter, wobbling. Dickie grabbed him by the ear. "You will not speak of this to your mother or Ava, and you certainly won't do it again. You will not leave the house unless it's for school for 2 weeks, and if either of them ask you about it, you'll say you're just feeling under the weather." Arthur's face was tight with pain, with too many types of pain, and he nodded until Dickie let him go. Then he stumbled into the counter and nearly fell down again. Dickie sneered. "I would sooner have no son than a son who's a wino." Arthur blinked slowly and nodded. "Now clean this up and take a shower, and when your mother wakes you up, you better be acting like a goddamn civilized human being again." And I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much. We've got a couple minutes left if anyone has any questions. Anybody online as well?
I'm an open book. The book is open.
Can
Yeah.
you just describe a little bit about your writing process, Rafael? How do things come and how do you, is there a way that you, a path that you follow?
Oh, yeah, I mean, really, I think it's there really is no rhyme or reason ultimately, and what gets written. This is such a great question, right? Because like the answer to this question varies by the day. So like as of today, what gets written kind of depends on where I'm at in terms of like what I've consumed media wise, like what I've read, what I've watched, like the art I've looked at, and also like where I'm at emotionally, right? So like if I'm in a place where maybe I'm working through something more difficult, right? Like, well, for instance, what I just read, right? It ends on that really difficult note, and the emotional tenor of that, right? And compared to like in Subscribe, it's so clear that those two are written in very different mental spaces, different days. A satire versus this kind of mystical I don't know, memoir, whatever, speculative fiction. So it really, there's just, I have accepted that there really is no rhyme or reason, right? And for some people there is. Well, there are plenty of people who are like, hey, I wake up and I write 1,500 words, or I write 500 words, and then I read a novel, and I do this, and I have a friend who's like that, who like every morning he's reading his novels, like in this specific time, and it works for him, and he's a brilliant writer. And so it's just kind of like, different stroke for different folks, and that's what I try to teach my students, especially because a lot of people will come into their MFA being like, okay, so I need to write for 2 hours every day, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, only if it works for you.
Probably. Do you, I don't have a formulated question, but in listening to those very different stories, I'm just curious, how maybe, I don't even know what I want to ask you totally. Do you see things visually? Some people are really visual, some people are.
Right, I know totally what you mean. So like, I read this interview with Colson Whitehead that he gave about the adaptation of Underground Railroad. I forget the director's name. He's the guy who made Moonlight. He adapted the Underground Railroad. And Colson Whitehead's like, hey, listen, like those two have been looking to work together since The Intuitionist, since Whitehead's very first book, and long before, it's like Barry something, I was forgetting his last name, but long before he did Moonlight. And Whitehead was like, yeah, listen, I like really don't, I'm so appreciative of his like visual intelligence here, right? And the way he could like frame a shot and cast these characters and like dress these sets, because as I'm writing this story, right, my experience is like visual to some degree, but not to others. And he said he doesn't see his characters' faces, and I was like, yeah, 100%. Yeah, so like it's kind of for me, it's like really impressionistic. It's kind of like, whoa, this like very specifically vividly rendered scene, right? It's like very specific. This like one barn. This barn is really rendered in detail, and then I'm like, okay, and then they have to go to New Zealand. So like I'm and kind of like the process of getting from the barn to New Zealand, right, might not be rendered with the same level of like hyper cinematic detail. But yeah, I mean, there are writers who are like every single thing is ultra cinematic. Every single thing is like super lush, right? And really, really realized in almost like as if by like a camera, like in high definition. So I don't know, it varies, but like I'm kind of a combination of a lot of different things, perceptively.
Well, when I listen to your stories, it's very very emotional, and the emotional impact is very strong. And so I was just curious about how things emerge for you. As a listener, it was a very emotional journey for both stories in very different ways, but very emotional. Like I felt it in my body and I felt it in my chest. And so, thank you.
Thank you, Lee. I mean, I really appreciate hearing that from you, because it was a very emotional process to write both of these stories, right? Even though Like and Subscribe is more satirical, openly satirical, there are still, I mean, I just gave this like 2-hour lecture yesterday in my queer narratives class that was like Belle Delphine, Marina Abramovich, Valerie Solanas, and Britney Spears. And like, I was like, oh, like this is like my pièce de résistance for the semester, and now I'm done. I hand this class off to my co-teacher, you know what I mean? Like, I have nothing else to say. And because like, it's because even with the lives of those like really remarkable women, having not nearly as much in common with my own, as for instance, some of the circumstances in the last show, in the second story I read, I still have really intense, feelings of like admiration or sadness, right? Especially around Britney Spears' conservatorship. So glad that she was able to come out of that. But like, just like big feelings, about these folks who are essentially like proxies, right, for a lot of people's emotions. Any good questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've never asked you about how the last show unfolded for you. It's a very unique feeling setup. I mean, the structure of the 3 different spaces. I think it's beautifully done, and I know you share the transition, but I don't even feel like it's necessary that you share the transition because it's so clear that we're in different places. And I wonder how that happened for you in your brain.
Yeah, I really that story, I was thinking a lot about the dying brain, right? And I know you and I have talked about this, but like it's the idea that like the dying brain releases a chemical kind of like DMT, that kind of like eases the transition into the next state, right? And so again, playing around with the idea that like my grandma had this like quasi hallucinogenic experience as she was passing, right? And then she also became and has become something else, since and that got me like playing around with like, oh, like, okay, so if her brain is dying, right, and like becoming, and she is becoming something else, right, I started to think about like not only like how that would affect her interiority, right, like how this kind of like hallucinogenic end of life experience would affect her interiority, but also certain like cliches around dying, like, oh, my life flashed before my eyes. Okay, so like what if like not just her, like chronologically speaking, her life flashes before her eyes, but also like her every trace of her in space-time is suddenly made apparent to her. It's like a little bit like Borgesian, but like not as like neat. Like it's kind of like, oh, it's like Borges, but like on acid. So it's yeah, it was interesting because I also wanted to give her different places where she could work different things out. And Peter is like a fictional character. She didn't know a Peter, right? In the story, Peter is this guy who just kind of meets her at the broadcast, and is this sort of like almost Virgil to her Dante. And so she's talking to him, and then she's like looking in the past, and she's interacting with the present, and then there's all this like bleeding over, I think when you're dying, the boundaries among those spaces are particularly porous. And I just thought it was like cool to imagine, right? And cool to imagine, like, I won't give away how the story ends, but it's a very positive ending. And it's cool to imagine that for her, right? And not just have this same sort of set of like tired Western benedictions around death, right? Like, oh, I'm dying, oh God, oh, we must do this, it must be this way, and say this, and think this. It's like, okay, but like, what if it could be like a positive experience in a way?
Thank you. Yeah. So it sounds like it was a really artful way of you moving through your own grief process.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I think she had, for some time, been passing. And I was like alternately not reacting to it, and then just like a total wreck. Like I couldn't even attend her funeral because I was like, whoa. I would love to, but like this, and I think some of the circumstances around, like, nothing to do with my family, right? Like, but the circumstances around, like, the Western medicine circumstances around her death, right? Of like, okay, like, you're gonna pass in this really sterile setting, in this, where we're trying to do every possible intervention, right? Not because we like necessarily care about their quality of life, but because we're very fearful fundamentally. Like, yeah, this is not my family, but just like medicine in general, just like end of life palliative care stuff, and the kind of the back and forth about the DNR, right? And like even Western medicine will be like, listen, you really should sign a DNR because if her heart stops, it's going to be horrifically traumatic on her body to revive her. So yeah, there's also like the medicine piece in there as well, and sort of threading the needle, right? That way.
Thank you.
Oh,
So I was just wondering, like, generally in your writing process, if you can generalize this at all, in short stories, how much redrafting do you do on average? Like, how whole does it come out, and how much do you work it until you're happy?
It's so funny because it feels like a short story is so different from a novel in that way. And I love you are already like absolutely picking up on that because you're like in the short story specifically versus the novel, not just like writing in general. Because the short stories, it's so much easier to kind of stick the landing in the first try. And then you're really doing the more heavy editorial lifting with the editor after the book is sold. Whereas with a novel, you just endlessly redraft until you're selling it. And I think this short story it's just like, I was talking at the event at Confluence last night about how like short stories are a little bit, it's this annoying irony where it's like in the publishing industry, they're like, oh, collection, it's so hard to market, what do we do? And I actually I had this written, but I wrote Confidence to kind of Trojan horse. Yeah.
Smart, yeah.
And I mean, I wish I could claim that it was my idea, my agency. But this, it's like, well, what do we do with this, right? And yeah, there are so many story collections that have blown up, right? Like the obvious being Her Body and Other Parties, Carmen Machado, but I also had a friend, Janelle Brinkley, who had his collection blow up. Like, well, here's what it's called, something man. I'll think of it. But like really big collections, and then of course then you have like elder statesmen in the literary scene, like George Saunders, who really just puts out collections, and they are amazing. Karen Russell, another fantastic example. Orange World, phenomenal. So like you have these really established folks, and these kind of folks who are up and coming and getting more established, and the collections are really blowing up. So it's kind of a weird push and pull, because a collection is for me so much easier to write and easier to make really personal. Not that a novel isn't, but I think there are so many more places to hide in a longer piece of fiction than there are in shorter pieces of fiction.
I like the way you said
Yeah.
that. Yeah, it's more places.
There is certainly one of those guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much, and thank you again to Rafael. We have Bugsy, Confidence, and Comedown available at the front desk. I'm going to move some chairs, and we'll get some books signed. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.